I want to start with something you can do right now. If you're near a ceramic mug, your tea, your coffee, anything, pick it up, hold it for a second. Now tap it gently with your fingernail. What did you hear? If it was a dull thud, a dead flat sound, that's ordinary pottery, clay fired at a relatively low temperature, dense, opaque, heavy. But if it rang, if there was a brief, clear, almost musical note, like a very small bell, then what you're holding is something chemically different. Something that for 300 years was the most fiercely guarded industrial secret in the world. Something that drove European kings to bankruptcy, sent spies into China, and produced one of the most spectacular acts of industrial espionage in history. That ring is the sound of porcelain, and for centuries it was the sound of a fake being exposed. Because in 17th century Europe, the fake porcelain problem was enormous. Chinese porcelain was arriving in small, expensive, heavily traded quantities, and the demand for it was completely out of control, which meant there was an enormous market for things that looked like porcelain but weren't. And the only reliable way a merchant could tell the real thing from an expensive fake was to tap it. Listen for that ring, and yes, this is real. Tap it gently against their teeth, which are sensitive enough to feel the difference in density and texture through vibration. Today we're going to talk about why that ring was so hard to fake, why European chemists, alchemists, and kings spent decades trying and failing to reproduce it, how a French Jesuit priest embedded himself in a secret Chinese city of kilns to steal their recipe, and what he found when he got there. I'm Alexandra, welcome to the Hidden Life of Things, everyday history for anyone who's ever looked at something ordinary and wondered, how did this actually get here? To understand the porcelain obsession, you first need to understand what European pottery was actually like before porcelain arrived. Because there's a tendency to think of this as just a taste thing, Europeans saw something prettier and wanted it, but it was more fundamental than that. European pottery in the medieval and early modern period was, by the standards of what was coming out of China, genuinely inferior as a functional material. It was thick, it was heavy, it was porous, which meant that liquids could seep through it slowly, and therefore it absorbed smells. It was opaque, and it had a critical weakness. Pour boiling water into a cold ceramic vessel and it could crack. The thermal shock, the rapid change in temperature, was more than the material could handle. Think about what that means in practice. Tea and coffee were becoming fashionable across Europe in the 17th century. Both require boiling water, and the vessels Europeans had for drinking them were genuinely not up to the job. Cracking, leaking, absorbing the flavor of previous drinks. Not exactly ideal for the new fashionable beverages of the age. And then Chinese porcelain started arriving in meaningful quantities. Thin, light, translucent, hold a piece up to a candle and you could see the shadow of your hand through it. Non-porous, completely sealed, nothing seeped in or out, handles boiling water without cracking, and when you tap it, that ring, clear and sustained like a small bell. Europeans had never seen anything like it. Their best craftspeople couldn't explain it. Their best scientists couldn't replicate it. And the harder they tried to work out what it was made of, the more they examined broken fragments, the more papers learned men wrote, the further they seemed to get from an answer. Various theories circulated. One widely repeated claim was that porcelain was made from shells buried underground for 100 years, then dug up and processed. Another suggested egg white was involved. Others thought it was a form of compressed and specially treated glass. Marco Polo, describing porcelain he had seen during his travels in China, used a word that became the European name for the material, porcellana, which referred to a type of shell that the translucent white surface reminded him of. None of the theories were right, and the truth that it required two specific materials fired together at a very specific high temperature was not something that could be deducted from looking at the finished object. Now here's something odd about how the porcelain craze developed. Because it wasn't just that Europeans found porcelain beautiful and technically impressive, there was also something else going on, a set of beliefs about what porcelain could do that went far beyond pottery. The most widespread of these was the belief that porcelain could detect poison. The idea circulated persistently through European courts from the 16th century onwards that a genuine piece of Chinese porcelain would crack or change color or sweat or show some visible reaction if food or drink containing poison was placed in it or on it. A porcelain cup was, according to this belief, a kind of built-in security system, a poison detector disguised as tableware. Kings and emperors, people who had very good reason to worry about assassination, were particularly receptive to this idea. The Ottoman Sultan had a famous collection of Celadon porcelain, a type of Chinese pottery with a distinctive grey-green glaze, specifically because of the belief in its poison-detecting properties. European monarchs followed suit. Now, here's the important thing to know. This belief was almost certainly spread deliberately. Historians who have traced the origins of the poison detection myth have found strong evidence that it was propagated by European merchants, particularly Dutch traders in the 17th century who were trying to move expensive Chinese ceramics as a marketing tool. You can't replicate this. Only we have access to it. And by the way, it detects poison. That kind of selling point is, as marketing goes, hard to beat. The porcelain didn't detect poison. There is no mechanism by which it could, but the belief made it more desirable, which raised the price, which made it more of a status symbol, which made it more desirable. A self-reinforcing cycle of perceived value. And the higher the perceived value, the more incentive to fake it, which is where the tooth test comes back in. By the 17th century, the demand for Chinese porcelain across Europe so dramatically outstripped the supply that a significant fake market had developed. European potters were producing objects that looked like porcelain, similar colors, similar shapes, sometimes similar glazes, but weren't. Soft paste porcelain, tin glazed earthenware, various other materials. Some of these fakes were sold honestly as imitations, others were not. And here's the problem. If you don't know what porcelain actually is, if you can't identify the specific chemical composition, how do you tell the genuine article from a well-made fake? You use your senses. You look at it. Is it translucent when held to light? You feel it. Is the surface completely smooth or non-porous? You weigh it. Is it lighter than it looks? And you tap it. You listen for the ring. The ring test works because genuine hard paste porcelain fired at over 1,200 degrees Celsius undergoes a chemical transformation at a molecular level. The clay and the specific feldspatic rock it's mixed with fuse together into something that is no longer really clay. It's closer to a form of glass ceramic, and that material has acoustic properties that ordinary pottery just doesn't have. The ring is real. It comes from the physics of the material, and it can be faked just by shaping something to look similar. Dealers tapping pieces against their teeth were using the sensitivity of tooth enamel, which itself is very hard and transmits vibration clearly, to feel the difference in density and resonance. It was practical, it was quick, and it worked better than any visual inspection in the hands of someone who knew what they were feeling for. The 17th century merchant checking a piece of porcelain against his teeth was doing something not entirely different from the modern jeweler who holds a diamond up to the light and rotates it, checking for the specific physical properties that only the real thing has. So what was the secret? Where did the ring come from? The answer was in a city in southeastern China called Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province. And to understand why Europeans couldn't replicate porcelain, you need to understand what Jingdezhen actually was. At its peak in the Ming and Qing dynasties, it had a population of around 1 million people, enormous for a pre-industrial city, the vast majority of whom worked in the porcelain industry in one way or another. Hundreds of kilns. The city ran continuously, day and night. Contemporary accounts describe the glow of the kilns visible for miles at night, and a permanent haze of smoke hanging over the city during the day. The production process was extraordinarily divided and specialized. A single piece of porcelain might pass through the hands of 70 or more workers, each responsible for one specific stage, one person preparing the clay, another shaping on the wheel, another applying the glaze, another painting the blue decoration, another loading the kiln. No single person knew the entire process. The knowledge was distributed deliberately across the workforce and kept strictly within families and within the city. It was by design impossible to steal by talking to any one person. The two key ingredients, and this was what centuries of European effort couldn't figure out from looking at the finished object, were kaolin and petunze. Kaolin is an exceptionally pure white clay formed by the geological decomposition of feldspar rock over millions of years. Petunze is a feldspathic rock that, when ground and combined with the kaolin and fired at temperatures above 1,200 degrees Celsius, undergoes a chemical transformation. The two materials fuse at a molecular level into something that is neither clay nor glass nor stone but has properties of all three. The kaolin gives you the workability, you can shape it. The petunze, when it melts and fuses during firing, fills every microscopic gap in the clay structure, making the material completely non-porous, translucent, and acoustically resonant. That ring you heard when you tapped your cup at the beginning, that's the petunze. That's the fused, glassy matrix ringing. Ordinary pottery fired at lower temperatures with different materials doesn't have that matrix. it thuds instead. And finding the right kaolin, the right purity, the right geological origin was itself part of the secret. The city had access to exceptionally high-quality kaolin deposits nearby. You couldn't just take any white clay and expect the same result. The cobalt blue, or the famous blue and white style, that vivid, rich blue that no European painter could quite match, came from cobalt oxide imported from Persia and Central Asia along Silk Road trade routes. The most iconic Chinese ceramic aesthetic in history was itself a product of global trade, a fusion of Chinese ceramic technology with Islamic pigment. The blue and white plate you think of as distinctively Chinese arrived at its look partly because of the preferences of Middle Eastern buyers and the availability of Central Asian minerals. By the early 18th century, the pressure to crack the porcelain secret had become intense enough that someone decided to go and find it directly. His name was François-Xavier d'Entrecol. He was a French Jesuit priest who had been working as a missionary in China since 1698 and who had, with patience and skill, established himself in the city around 1700. Not as a spy in any official sense, as a missionary, but what he did there was, by any reasonable definition, industrial espionage. He spent years there. He observed, he asked questions, he cultivated relationships with his Chinese Catholic converts who worked in the porcelain industry, men who trusted him as their priest and who told him gradually and over years things about the production processes that they could not have taught a foreign merchant or diplomat. He gathered information systematically and carefully about the ingredients, the kiln temperatures, the stages of production, the organization of the workshops, the specific nature of the clays. In September 1712, he wrote a long, detailed letter to his superiors in Paris describing what he had found. It was remarkable, an accurate, technically specific account of how Chinese porcelain was actually made, the ingredients, the ratios, the temperatures, the process. It is considered by historians of industrial espionage one of the most significant such documents ever produced. The first time the actual secret of Chinese porcelain was clearly set out in a European language. It arrived in Paris in 1712, and here's the thing. Johann Friedrich Böttger, an alchemist imprisoned in Saxony by Augustus the Strong, had cracked the secret of hard-based porcelain in 1708. D'Entrecol had spent over a decade gathering intelligence that was already 4 years out of date by the time it landed in Paris. The most meticulous act of industrial espionage in ceramic history was delivered to a problem that had already been solved, not by patient missionary work in China, but by a man in a dungeon who had been trying to make gold. D'Entrecol sent a second letter in 1722 with additional details. By then, the Meissen porcelain manufactory in Saxony had been commercially producing European porcelain for over a decade. I genuinely find this funny. History occasionally produces moments of timing so perfectly wrong that they feel almost designed as a joke. Let me tell you about Böttger properly, because his story is too good to leave as a footnote. Johann Friedrich Böttger was a young German alchemist who had made himself famous, and this is the crucial detail, by claiming he could turn base metals into gold, which was not true. Nobody could do this. But Böttger was either a brilliant showman or a genuinely convinced self-deceiver, and his demonstrations were impressive enough that word reached powerful people who very much wanted gold. Friedrich I of Prussia had him taken into protective custody. Böttger escaped to Dresden, which turned out to be the worst possible choice of destination, because Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony, a man who had traded 600 cavalry soldiers for 150 porcelain vessels, and described his own obsession as maladie de porcelain, porcelain sickness, promptly had him arrested and imprisoned. Augustus wanted gold. Böttger was going to produce it or remain imprisoned until he did. He spent years in a dungeon and then in a closely guarded laboratory, trying and failing to make gold. Augustus eventually lost patience and assigned a serious scientist, a mathematician and physicist named Ehrenfried Walter von Schirnhaus, who had actually been quietly working on porcelain for years, to redirect Böttger's efforts. By 1707, with Böttger now cooperating, apparently motivated by a growing awareness of what might happen if he didn't, they were making real progress. In January 1708, the first European hard-paste porcelain was successfully fired. White, translucent, hard, and when tapped, ringing like a bell. The credit question is genuinely unresolved. Von Schirnhaus had done most of the serious scientific work. Böttger's chemical instincts may have contributed the final breakthrough. We can't know, because von Schirnhaus died in October 1708, just months after the success, and the subsequent historical account was written by Böttger's patrons. What we know is that a man who had been trying to make gold accidentally became the first European to make porcelain. His reward was a comfortable apartment inside a fortress with guards on the door. He was finally released in 1714. He died in 1719, aged 37, his health destroyed by years of exposure to chemical fumes and kiln heat. Augustus founded the Meissen porcelain manufactory in 1710 in a castle specifically chosen because it was easy to guard. The new European secret was to be protected as carefully as the Chinese had protected theirs. Workers couldn't leave freely, correspondence was monitored, the recipe was classified. The man who had unlocked the secret never fully got to enjoy it. The blue and white porcelain that Europeans were so desperate to replicate, those iconic patterns you recognize instantly, is not purely Chinese in origin. The cobalt pigment came from Persia along Silk Road routes. The style itself developed partly in response to Islamic aesthetic preferences. A significant portion of Chinese porcelain in the 14th and 15th century was made specifically for Middle Eastern buyers who preferred that color combination. The Dutch then copied it in Delft, making their own tin-glazed earthenware versions that became their own tradition. The Willow pattern on millions of pieces of British crockery is an 18th century English invention designed in Britain, inspired by Chinese originals, now so associated with British tableware that most people assume it's always been English. The thing that started in the kilns of China traveled through the hands of Arab and Portuguese traders, drove Augustus the Strong to trade soldiers for vases and call himself porcelain sick, sent a French Jesuit priest to spend a decade in a Chinese industrial city, and trapped a German alchemist in a dungeon until he accidentally solved a problem he hadn't been assigned. That thing is now sitting in your kitchen, in a charity shop, on a wedding registry. We treat it as ordinary. We've always treated whatever we have enough of as ordinary. But tap it. Listen for that ring. That clear, brief, bell-like tone is the sound of kaolin and feldspathic rock fused together at over 1,200 degrees. It's the sound that told a 17th century merchant he wasn't being scammed. It's the sound that Augustus the Strong was willing to trade an army regiment to own. It's the sound that a French spy spent a decade in China trying to understand, and that a German alchemist in a dungeon worked out first. It's in your kitchen, and it rings every time you tap it. So, next time you pick up a piece of porcelain, a mug, a plate, a bowl, tap it gently with your fingernail and actually listen. That sound is 1,000 years of accumulated craft knowledge from Jiangxi province. It's the Silk Road. It's a poison detection myth invented by Dutch merchants to sell expensive pottery. It's Augustus the Strong, porcelain sick, trading soldiers for vases. It's a spy who was 4 years too late, and it's an alchemist who wanted gold and got something more lasting. All of it in an object you use to hold your tea. The most ordinary things carry the most extraordinary histories. That's always been the point. History isn't only in museums. Sometimes it's in your kitchen, ringing quietly, waiting for you to listen. If this made you go and tap every ceramic thing in your house, firstly, same. And secondly, The Hidden Life of Things is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. A follow or a like genuinely helps. And if someone in your life has a set of china they've never thought to question, send this to them. And here's your clue for next time. You put them on without thinking, probably every day. They've been sitting on human faces in one form or another for nearly 1,000 years. But when they first appeared, they had nothing to do with the sun. They were a tool of power used in courts of law to make sure nobody in the room could read the face of the person who mattered most. From there, they ended up on the faces of fighter pilots, then movie stars, then everyone. And somewhere along the way, they became the universal symbol of cool without anyone quite deciding that was what they were for. What are they? Stay curious. I'm Alexandra, and I'll talk to you next week.